I know it's there. I've got to believe it because I see the reactions, I see the photographs, I see the critics and people who
She was the woman the whole world thought it knew. The gamine haircut, the little black dress, the voice that turned Moon River into something like a prayer. For 40 years, Audrey Hepburn was the definition of elegance. Poised, composed, seemingly untouched by the mess that swallowed so many of her Hollywood peers. But elegance, it turns out, can be its own kind of armor. And in the last months of her life, when the armor finally came off, Audrey said something that surprised almost everyone who thought they understood her story. She wasn't talking about either of her husbands. She wasn't talking about a co-star, or a secret romance, or anyone the tabloids had ever linked her to. The man she said she never fully got over was someone who had barely been present for most of her life at all. To understand why, you have to go back to the very beginning, long before the fame, long before the film sets, back to a little girl in Brussels who didn't yet know how much one absence could shape a lifetime. Audrey Kathleen Rustin was born in Brussels in May of 1929, the daughter of a Dutch baroness and an English-Austrian businessman. On paper, her early life looked enviable. Multiple countries, multiple languages, a family that moved comfortably among European high society. By the time she was still a young girl, she could already speak several languages fluently, a skill that would later serve her well in a career built on international appeal. But underneath the polish, something else was happening. Her parents, Joseph Rustin and Ella van Heemstra, had both become swept up in the far-right political currents of the 1930s. They attended fascist rallies. They associated with figures who, within a decade, would be responsible for unimaginable atrocities across Europe. It was a chapter of her family history that Audrey would spend the rest of her life trying not to talk about, and one that biographers have only pieced together slowly over the decades since her death. Then, in 1935, her father simply left. He walked out of the marriage and out of his children's lives, relocating to London and eventually drifting further into extremist political circles before the family severed contact almost entirely. Audrey was 6 years old. She wouldn't understand the full context of his politics for years. All she understood, as a child, was that her father was gone, and that he wasn't coming back. Those who later wrote about her life have pointed again and again to this single event as the hinge on which everything else turned. A 6-year-old girl doesn't process abandonment as ideology or circumstance. She processes it as rejection. And that rejection, biographers argue, followed Audrey into every significant relationship she would ever have. If losing her father was the first wound, what came next deepened it in ways that are almost hard to comprehend. Hoping to keep her safe, Audrey's mother sent her to live in Arnhem, in the Netherlands, believing that a neutral country would be spared the violence gathering across the continent. It wasn't. In May of 1940, German forces invaded, and the Netherlands spent the rest of the war under brutal occupation. Audrey was 10 years old when the occupation began, and she would spend the next 5 years learning what war does to a childhood. She adopted a Dutch-sounding name to obscure her English ancestry. She watched relatives disappear. Members of her extended family were arrested and executed by occupying forces, a trauma she rarely discussed publicly in detail, but one that friends said never fully left her. As the war dragged on, she is widely reported to have assisted the Dutch resistance in small but dangerous ways, including carrying messages hidden on her person. She had trained as a ballet dancer before the war, and during the occupation she used that training in secret, performing at underground gatherings held to raise money for the resistance, in rooms where the audience couldn't applaud for fear of being heard. During the final, brutal winter of the war, known to the Dutch as the Hunger Winter, food supplies collapsed almost entirely. Audrey and her family survived, like thousands of others, on what little could be found: tulip bulbs, ground into something edible, among the more infamous examples. She emerged from the war severely malnourished, anemic, and suffering respiratory problems that some biographers believe affected her health for the rest of her life. When liberation finally came in 1945, a relief worker handed the teenage Audrey a piece of chocolate. She spoke about that moment for the rest of her life as one of the defining memories of her childhood, and decades later, it would quietly shape the final chapter of her story in ways almost no one saw coming at the time. Audrey's rise to fame in the early 1950s was fast, and by most accounts slightly bewildering to her. She hadn't set out to become a movie star, but after a chance discovery by the French novelist Colette, who cast her in a Broadway adaptation of Gigi, and then a breakout film role in Roman Holiday, she found herself, almost overnight, one of the most sought-after actresses in the world. It was during this period that she met the actor Mel Ferrer, introduced through mutual friends and later paired with him on stage in a production of Ondine. The connection between them was immediate. They married in Switzerland in September of 1954, and for a while, the relationship functioned the way both of them seemed to want it to. Ferrer took an active hand in guiding Audrey's career, and Audrey, still relatively new to the machinery of Hollywood, leaned on his judgment. Over time, though, friends and colleagues began to notice that the balance in the marriage had shifted. What had started as guidance hardened into control. Ferrer, according to numerous accounts from people who worked with the couple, weighed in on nearly every professional decision Audrey made, and increasingly on her personal life as well. For a woman who was, by any measure, one of the most famous people alive, she was described by those close to her as unusually deferential inside her own home. Layered on top of this was a private grief that the public rarely saw. Audrey wanted children desperately. Friends described it as one of the most consistent, deeply felt wishes of her adult life. She suffered a miscarriage in 1955 and endured a serious accident while filming The Unforgiven in 1959, when she was thrown from a horse during a scene, breaking bones and losing the pregnancy she was carrying at the time. It wasn't until 1960 that she finally gave birth to her first son, Sean. She stepped away from acting for roughly a year afterward to focus entirely on motherhood, an almost unheard-of move for an actress at the peak of her commercial value. But the marriage itself never recovered its footing. Rumors of infidelity, on both sides, circulated for years. By 1968, after 14 years together, Audrey and Ferrer divorced. Those who knew her at the time described her as exhausted, but also, for the first time in over a decade, unmistakably her own person again. By the late 1960s, Audrey Hepburn had reached a level of fame that few actresses of any era have matched. She had starred in Breakfast at Tiffany's, Charade, and My Fair Lady, and had become, in the eyes of much of the world, a kind of living symbol of style itself. And then, almost without warning, she stepped back from it. The decision baffled studio executives, who were still offering her nearly any role she wanted. But Audrey's reasoning, as she explained it to friends, was straightforward. She wanted her son to have a childhood that didn't revolve around cameras and publicity, the kind of stable, unremarkable upbringing she herself had never gotten to have. It was around this time, during a Mediterranean cruise, that she met Andrea Ditti, an Italian psychiatrist. Ditti was warm and socially at ease in a way that felt, to Audrey, like a relief after years inside a controlling marriage. Within months, they were married, and Audrey relocated to Rome, embracing what she hoped would be a quieter, more private existence as a wife and mother. For a time, it seemed to work, but Ditti, it turned out, had habits he kept carefully out of view during their courtship. Reports of his affairs became a recurring feature of the Italian press, and unlike the relative discretion of her first marriage, this new chapter of her life played out under constant, unwelcome public scrutiny. Audrey had left Hollywood specifically to escape that kind of exposure, and instead found herself living inside a different version of it. She stayed in the marriage longer than many around her expected, partly for the sake of their son, Luca, born in 1970, and partly because walking away from commitments was never something that came easily to her. But the combination of repeated infidelity and relentless press attention eventually became untenable, and the marriage ended in the early 1980s. Audrey rarely discussed the divorce publicly in detail. Those close to her said it left her more private and more cautious about who she let in than she had ever been before. Before either marriage, and rarely given the attention it deserves in most retellings of her life, there was William Holden. The two met on the set of Sabrina in 1954, a production that was already tense before filming even began. Humphrey Bogart, one of her co-stars, had wanted the role to go to his wife, Lauren Bacall, and made his resentment toward Audrey known throughout the shoot. Holden reacted to her in the opposite way. The two grew close quickly, and what began as on-set chemistry developed into a genuine romantic relationship. By most accounts, Holden fell hard and at one point asked Audrey to marry him. She turned him down. The reason, as she later explained privately to friends, wasn't complicated. She wanted children, and Holden had undergone a vasectomy years earlier and was unable to have more. It was a deal breaker she couldn't set aside, however much she cared for him. Holden, by most accounts, never fully got over it. For Audrey, the episode became something of a quiet marker in her own life. Proof, even at a young age, that she was capable of walking away from something real if it didn't align with the future she needed for herself. After her divorce from Diddy, Audrey did something that surprised people who expected a triumphant return to the screen. She withdrew from public life almost entirely. She settled into a farmhouse in the Swiss village of Tollequinaz, a property she had owned since the 1960s and had named La Paisible, the peaceful place. She turned down major roles, avoided the social circuit that had defined so much of her adult life, and by most accounts spent her days gardening, cooking, and living about as ordinary a life as a woman of her fame could manage. Neighbors later described her as simply that, a neighbor, someone who said good morning at the local market and never asked to be treated as anything more. It was during this period that she met Robert Wolders, a Dutch-born actor who had recently lost his wife, the actress Merle Oberon. They met at a charity event in the late 1970s, and what began as a friendship developed slowly into something steadier. Neither of them, by most accounts, was looking for a repeat of the relationships they'd already lived through. What they built together was notably low-key compared to her marriages. They never formally married, though Audrey reportedly introduced him as her husband in most settings that mattered to her, treating the commitment as real regardless of the paperwork. For more than a decade, they shared life at La Paisible, and Wolders became, by nearly every account from people who knew them, the steadiest presence in Audrey's adult life. In 1988, Audrey accepted a role that would come to define the last chapter of her public life: Goodwill Ambassador for UNICEF. Over the following years, she traveled to some of the most difficult humanitarian crises on Earth: Ethiopia, Sudan, Bangladesh, El Salvador, Somalia among them, sitting with children in conditions that, in some cases, echoed the deprivation she herself had lived through as a child in wartime Netherlands. Those who traveled with her, including Wolders, who accompanied her on many of these missions, consistently described her approach to the work as something closer to obligation fulfilled than career reinvention. She rarely spoke publicly about the connection, but people close to her believed it traced directly back to that piece of chocolate handed to a starving teenager more than 40 years earlier. In 1992, not long after returning from a mission to Somalia, Audrey began experiencing severe abdominal pain. Testing revealed a rare and aggressive cancer that had originated in her appendix. Surgery could not stop its spread, and the diagnosis was terminal. Those close to her in her final months described her as remarkably composed, less focused on her own mortality than on the humanitarian work she worried she was leaving unfinished. Too weak to travel by commercial flight, she was flown home to Switzerland on a private jet arranged by her longtime friend, the designer Hubert de Givenchy, who had dressed her for nearly 40 years and remained one of her closest confidants until the end. She spent her final Christmas at La Paisible, surrounded by the people who mattered most to her. On January 20th, 1993, she died peacefully at home, with her family and Wolders nearby. Her funeral was small and intimate, held at a local church in Tollequinaz. Gregory Peck, her co-star from Roman Holiday nearly 40 years earlier, the man credited with insisting she receive equal billing on a film where she was still a complete unknown, read a poem at the service. Both of her former husbands attended. So did her sons. So did Robert Wolders. So who, in the end, was the man Audrey Hepburn couldn't fully let go of? Not Ferrer, not Diddy, not Holden, and not even Wolders, who had given her, by every account, the steadiest and most peaceful years of her adult life. In her final years, in conversations with people close to her, Audrey returned repeatedly to one figure: her father. It wasn't nostalgia, and by most accounts it wasn't simple grief either. It was something closer to an open question that never resolved. Joseph Rustin had left when she was 6. He hadn't come for her during school holidays. He'd sent her, unknowingly, into the path of a war. And when she finally tracked him down decades later through the Red Cross, discovering that he had been living quietly in Dublin all along, the reunion she had spent years imagining turned out to be almost nothing at all. A man who offered her little warmth and even less explanation. And yet she forgave him, not performatively, but in the most concrete way available to her. She supported him financially for the rest of his life, even after he offered her so little in return. Biographers who have studied her personal correspondence and interviewed people close to her in her later years have argued that nearly every major romantic choice she made throughout her life, the pull toward older, authoritative men, the tendency to stay in relationships long after they'd stopped serving her, traces back to that original absence. It's a theory, not a certainty, and Audrey herself was famously private about her inner life. But the pattern, laid out across 4 decades of relationships, is difficult to dismiss entirely. What's clear is that she never stopped wondering about him, even after his death. Those close to her said she carried the question without bitterness, in a way that friends found almost more striking than anger would have been. Not resentment, but a kind of unresolved curiosity about a man who had simply never let her in. She never got the answer she was looking for. He died without giving her one. Robert Wolders, reflecting on her afterward, said what stayed with him most about Audrey wasn't her fame or her famous elegance. It was her capacity to keep forgiving people who had given her very little reason to. That capacity, more than any film role, may be the truest thread running through her entire life. From the 6-year-old girl waiting at a boarding school for a father who never showed up, to the woman who spent her final years kneeling beside starving children on the other side of the world, trying, in whatever way she could, to give them something she had spent her whole life searching for herself. It's worth pausing on how close the entire story came to never happening. Before Hollywood, before Da Vinci, before any of it, Audrey's real ambition was ballet. She had trained seriously as a dancer throughout her adolescence, and after the war ended, she moved to Amsterdam and later to London specifically to pursue it as a career. She studied under respected instructors, worked hard, and by every account took the discipline of it seriously. But the years of wartime malnutrition had done lasting damage to her body. Instructors who evaluated her told her, gently but plainly, that her frame and her physical development had been permanently affected by the deprivation of the occupation years, that she had the talent and the discipline, but not, at this point, the physical instrument to become a prima ballerina.